Welcome, everybody, and this week we have a topic that John and I have been really looking forward to covering for quite a while, and this was a pick that John made. So, John, which topic will we be covering this week?
So, we're going to be talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is also known as CTE. It is the brain disorder that is caused by playing football and other high-impact sports. And I just wanted to talk briefly about, the past few weeks. I'm involved in a fantasy football league at work, and I don't really watch football. I haven't watched a football game this entire year. To me, it's just stats and trying to win based on stats, But I get irritated because, my tight end is out this week and my quarterback is questionable, and I get mad. But then it dawned on me, these are human beings. These are people who are playing this sport and possibly sustaining, lifelong injuries to my annoyance.
Right.
And so I thought it might be interesting if we look at the sport a little bit more objectively and dig into chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So if you're ready, I'm ready to jump into it.
Let's do it.
All right, sir.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
and John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting.
So, John, I know one of the most prominent cases of CTE, the one that really made a lot of headlines, that almost, also hits the heart hardest when you learn more about it, was Mike Webster.
Yeah.
And, we did a bit of research on him. What can you tell us about Mike Webster?
So Mike Webster was the guy that kind of started all of this. Mm-hmm. He was a center for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Mm-hmm. He talked often while playing about his tactic for controlling other players, which was to go head first at them. And a lot of, they made the movie Concussion about his death and the doctor that did the autopsy on him. But one of the things they didn't cover as well was just how damaged his body was when he died. He had many herniated discs. He had broken vertebrae. He had a torn rotator cuff, dislocated shoulder. His heart was enlarged. He had cellulitis. His teeth and hair were literally falling out of his head. His son described that his father would super glue his teeth back into his head.
Jesus.
By the time he passed away, he was divorced. He was living in his van, and he would use a taser to put himself to sleep, because he couldn't sleep otherwise. He had night terrors and, just a lot of mental health problems.
The guy who did an autopsy on him was a doctor named Amalu, Dr. Bennett Amalu, I believe is his full name.
And he is who Will Smith played in the movie. Nigerian-born, heavily educated, very smart man. And he's seen this guy. He has no idea who he is. He doesn't watch football. And the guy's legs look like tree trunks, and, his body is damaged. And he's like, I'm going to fix this guy's brain, which is a standard autopsy thing where you remove the brain and you weigh it and you run tests on it. And it's standard for somebody who's died from head trauma. It's not standard for somebody that's died from, other causes. Yeah. And so he removes the brain and it looks perfectly fine. And he doesn't understand it. He's like, this guy has all of these other problems, except his brain is completely whole. So he decides to, basically do an autopsy on the brain. And the way you do that is you kind of cut it like a loaf of bread, and you take slices of it and you run it underneath. And he noticed all of these proteins in the brain that were blocking cellular activity. And he basically found what was the first case of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this started the reason this started a nationwide push on the NFL to investigate this is because when Webster's wife went to the NFL with the claim that her husband was suffering all of these symptoms from playing football, the retirement administration for the NFL agreed with her.
Right.
So there was like 4 other doctors that were reviewing these cases, and it was the first time the NFL went on the record and said this sport causes brain injuries. And the reason why, and this is all based on a Frontline documentary called A League of Denial. They outline that the average football player gets hit 1,000 to 1,500 times per season. And that's at a force of about 30 Gs. So it's like getting in 1,000 to 1,500 car crashes a year. That's the hits they're sustaining.
Yeah, and I think, what was notable, the reason why Mike Webster, it was such a prominent instance is, first of all, he was, especially for a center, like he was actually really popular and loved by the team. You think about it, usually nobody celebrates the center or
Right.
buys his jersey, but he really was. And he also, like his symptoms, like think about if you knew a loved one, if your own father or your son or your, spouse was living out of a van, supergluing their teeth back in and tasing themselves.
Right.
And completely like speaking gibberish, like and really having in just a terrible mental state 24/7 perpetually, how heartbreaking that is. So there was that, but also the fact that I think what made Omalu such a credible, I know they tried to discredit him, being some like Nigerian doctor who probably doesn't know proper medicine, blah, 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 is
They accused him of being a voodoo doctor.
right. But the reason they were threatened, and I think what does today add to his credibility, is he has literally never ever had any involvement or beef with the NFL. It wasn't like he had a reason to. It wasn't like he had a family member who had suffered it, or it wasn't like Webster's family had paid him to find something. Like he never watched a game of football in his life. He didn't have any feelings, pro or against football. He literally couldn't have cared less. And so that's what made him like the best doctor for it, not just how brilliant he was.
He just was looking for the scientific result. You're right.
Exactly. Like he literally had no emotional context or investment either way to the game itself. Think about how many families have been torn apart, how many stories like Mike Webster's that we don't know about.
Yeah, and there was a doctor out of Boston University. Her name is Ann McKee, excuse me. She was following this kind of closely, and she does pathology on human brains. And somebody came to her and said, "Hey, would you be interested in seeing the brain of a former NFL football player?" And she's obsessed with brains, basically. And she jumped at it. She's like, "Yes, bring it in. I want to see." And so she got a hold of a few brains, like 5 or 6 of them. And she found CTE in all of them. And so she teamed up with this WWF wrestler. His name was Chris Harvard. That was his character name. And he took a great deal of, battering in the sport of world wrestling. And he knew because of the amount of concussions that he sustained, he's terrified that he's going to have this. So he wants it studied as much as possible. So he goes around and calls the families of NFL players who have just lost their loved one and asks them for their brain. It's kind of weird, but he does it in a way that is like, it needs to be studied.
Right.
We need to get answers, and you can help us do that. And so he was able to procure for her 115 brains from former NFL players, and 114 of them had CTE.
Like, here, can you just one more time? How many brains did they get?
They got like 115, and they found CTE in 114.
That is over 99%.
Yes.
That is not like... I mean, you got to figure, even though it isn't 100%, you can basically say there is a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it was 50%, that is so telling. And one thing that just came to mind before I forget, it's like, I think for me, it was also one of the biggest turning points. I remember growing up, I grew up in San Diego, and especially at that time, like I was, and still am, I'm not going to lie, like big Chargers fan and everything. And, but at that time growing up, when you watched or thought San Diego Chargers, yeah, they had a few like exciting quarterbacks, but who like really was that team? Junior Seau.
Yeah.
Junior Seau was the San Diego Chargers, and they basically, Chargers fans mourned when he went to New England for his final couple seasons because he wanted to get a Super Bowl ring, but little did we know that a few years later we would be like seriously mourning when he took his life in 2012. And the fact that he shot himself in the chest, and he deliberately said, in a note written before, and in a when he gave a statement beforehand before taking his life, he basically said the reason he will be taking his life and doing it in the way he did it, preserving his brain, was so they could use his brain to study. He said he had it, he knew he had it, and he said, I'm not going to die like Webster, and I'm deliberately not, shooting myself in the head for this reason. So that is what was so, like, hit in the face, shocking.
The other thing about Junior Seau that people don't talk enough about is his life was going downhill before he died. He started to become violent. His family always described him as the nicest, kindest, most generous person. And then all of a sudden he became violent, got arrested for domestic violence, started a drug problem. All of this gambling started from out of nowhere, his family described it. And you're right. He shot himself in the chest in order to preserve his brain. And the one guy that wanted to look at it was Dr. Amalu. And the NFL made sure he did not. Yeah,
and I think the also shocking thing was Dr. Amalu, as you mentioned, as we talked about, was and still to this day is like the prominent doctor regarding this subject and everything. And when we talk about, he was going downhill, Junior Seau, like he was the nicest guy, greatest dad, greatest husband. And then it only suddenly started going downhill later on in his career. And in 2016, ABC News interviewed Dr. Amalu. And they asked him, because he brought up some of the side effects and symptoms, and he said it does cause aggression, sometimes very aggressive, violent behavior. And they asked him about probably arguably the most prominent instance of a beloved football player gone awry, and that was O.J. Simpson. And Amalu said, quote, I would bet my medical license that O.J. Simpson had CTE. He would bet his medical license. And to me, that is like it. And keep in mind, this, of course, I am not saying it. It does not. I'm not saying it justifies like murdering your wife.
No.
There's no justification, but there's a difference between a justification and an explanation. Like,
right, yeah.
if someone causes a terrible car accident and their blood alcohol content was like through the roof, that doesn't justify what they did, but that is an explanation as to why that happened, why you shouldn't drink and drive. That's an explanation. Yeah.
But it's also an explanation as to why you probably shouldn't play football. That's interesting because that same doctor from Boston University, Dr. Ann McKee, she also started finding CTE in young athletes. She did the autopsy on a brain of an 18-year-old. I believe they were from Pennsylvania, and she got a hold of their brain. They were killed in a car wreck or something. And she found, or maybe it was a disease, I don't recall. But regardless, she did the autopsy and fixed his brain and found CTE developing. And it kind of struck me that it's like we blame the NFL because they knew and they didn't do anything about it. There's a doctor named Dr. Ira Casson who has this famous interview on HBO where he denies whether it causes head injuries. Let's listen to that real fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ira Casson leads a team of NFL doctors who did a study of several hundred active players and reported that the concern over head injuries is overblown.
Is there any evidence, as far as you're concerned, that links multiple head injuries among pro football players with depression?
No.
With dementia?
No.
With early onset of Alzheimer's?
No.
Is there any evidence as of today that links multiple head injuries with any long-term problem like that?
In NFL players?
Yeah.
No.
So not the greatest audio quality, but you can tell from that is the standard NFL response to whether or not this causes injury. It was for many years in any way. And we know now that the NFL is taking steps, but I personally don't think they're enough, trying to figure out a better helmet to wear and,
right.
Things like that, where the sport is just too violent. And it will continue as long as the main attraction to it is the heavy hits. But going back to Ann McKee and her finding it in younger players, I know that you've been looking at some stuff on that, and I'm interested to hear what you found.
Yeah, so there was a study done by the University of Boston, or Boston University rather, in 2018 and 2017. And in this study, they found that 30%, a third of high school football players, not even college, like forget pro, forget college, high schoolers, 1 in 3 had CTE. So even if they said in high school, they graduated high school, went to college and said, you know what, I'm going to focus on my studies, I'm not even going to play football at all, they still have CTE. That to me is like, that gives me chills. It's shocking. It is that they already, by the time they graduate college, they have cognitive, behavioral, mood, and motor symptom issues during their life.
That's insane.
Like imagine your college-age kid, rather than worrying about how they're going to do on exams for graduate, rather than worrying, are they going to pick a bullshit degree that's not going to get them a job or not? Yeah. Like, the typical thing a parent will worry about, you have to worry, like, I mean, imagine they come home for break and you see, like, a lot of parents will see their kid acting a little obscure, peculiar, because they're going to college, going through all this change in their lives, but maybe wiped out, exhausted from all the studying, so they might, be a little different behaviorally, and, could it be, you would wonder, like, oh my God, is that them being just like a college kid?
Yeah, sometimes I think about, like, you see this footage of 10-year-old boys playing tackle football on the field, and one of them gets laid out.
Right.
and is out for like 4 minutes, and they have to go out there and revive them and bring them off the field. What parent goes, yeah, that's a good idea.
Right.
Let's keep doing that.
Right.
You know, at some point you're going to go, I don't want my child, sustaining these types of hits.
Well, yeah, and with you see, like they make a lot of investment, which you can say is good with like helmet technology, but that is a diminishing return because a helmet protects your skull. It doesn't protect your brain.
It doesn't protect your knees and your ankles and all the other things they're dealing with as well.
Right, and I think probably a lot of the rule changes, I would argue, maybe have a bigger impact than like the helmet changes. I know in college, I can actually pull up some details because I don't follow college too closely, but I remember in recent years watching a few college games where I think if a player led with their helmet, didn't even make helmet-to-helmet contact, but led with the helmet, like spearhead with their head down, looking at the ground while they went for the tackle, they were ejected out immediately.
Yeah.
And I think it may have been like a, warning, first offense, second offense, ejected, but I'll look up the details on that rule, but essentially the gist of it was like you could tell in college they weren't messing around with it at all. Like it was almost a zero tolerance policy, and I thought, if that was something that was implemented a lot earlier on, it would prevent a ton of concussions. I think a ton of because you would learn. Like they say, these players are kind of later in life, like relearning how to tackle. And a lot of people whine about it. And it's like, please give me a break. Like it's their job. Like you got to adjust on the job. Big deal. And you get paid decent money for it. So, but at the same time, it's like, okay, so if you teach it early enough, they are learning to tackle in a much more effective, safer manner. And that will just naturally change the game. They'll be tackling in that way. Later on, I think now that a lot of players are aware of it, they are even more cognizant of how the way they play is impacting their fellow players. Because even if there's a player on a rival team, like you don't want them to get laid out, knocked out, and so they are changing. I think a lot of these rule changes will have a huge effect on football. Who knows if it's going to eliminate, minimize. I mean, even if it minimizes the effect, like what would you say subjectively is like a quote unquote minimal effect? Right. Like, walking around with like Parkinson's like symptoms. Well, that's not okay to me, knowing my son's gonna, or forgetfulness with only some things when they're in their late 20s. No, that's not okay with me. So it's hard to say, like, what do you think on things that because I don't want to get up here and be all preachy about how like no NFL forever, no football, because there are gonna be people, and it has to be hard, like your kids growing up, going through tough times in life, or adjusting, and then suddenly your kid comes home and is like, they found something they love, they're passionate about. It's got to be hard to be like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, I think it does come down to rule changes for now, but I think the sport, the way it's played now, is definitely going to change over the next 20 years.
Right.
And the fans may not like that because the whole draw to the sport is the heavy hitting. But when you see the effects of these concussions, you would understand the need for the rule changes. And what I want to play now is just a clip of an all-star quarterback named Troy Aikman, who gets hit in a game. And the two people talking in this clip, one is a reporter for ESPN, whose name I'm dropping, and the other is a guy named Lee Steinberg. He is the guy that the movie Jerry Maguire was based on. And here's what he says about football injuries, or when he witnessed one.
I went to visit Troy, who was sitting in a darkened hospital room, all alone.
The room is dark because Aikman can't even stand looking into the light. It's, it's this sort of surreal scene where the city is celebrating and the quarterback who won the game is in the hospital with his agent.
He looked at me and he said, "Lee, where am I?" And I said, "Well, you're in the hospital." And he said, "Well, why am I here?" And I said, "Because you suffered a concussion today." And he said, "Well, who did we play?" And I said, "The 49ers." And he said, "Did we win?" "Yes, you won." "Did I play well?" "Yes, you played well." What does that, and so what's that mean? It means you're going to the Super Bowl.
5 minutes later, they're sitting there, they're continuing to hang out, and Aikman suddenly turns to Steinberg and says, "What am I doing here?" And the next thing you know, they're reliving this conversation they'd had 5 minutes earlier.
For a minute, I thought he was joking. And I went through the same sequence of answers again. And his face brightened and we celebrated again. Maybe 10 minutes passed. And he looked at me with the same puzzled expression and asked the same sequence of questions. It terrified me to see how tender the bond was between sentient consciousness and potential dimension confusion was.
So you can tell from that clip that, when somebody sustains a head injury in the sport, it's kind of obvious. And I know that a lot of players are now speaking out more and more against even playing it at all.
Right.
So you had found something that you wanted to share on previous greats and their stance on football today.
Here's an article on, this is actually 9 NFL players who wouldn't let their sons play football.
Oh.
And here are a few of them. Troy Aikman has told HBO's Real Sports, "I think we're at a real crossroads. It relates to the grassroots of our sport, because if I had a 10-year-old boy, I don't know that I'd be inclined to encourage him to go play football in light of what we're learning." Troy Aikman.
Well, if anybody would know.
Yeah, and Adrian Peterson, who is one of the most decorated, one of the greatest running backs of all time. He had a fairly short season, still plays, but the highlight, the heyday, you could say, of his career was fairly short-lived, but in that time, record-breaking and, was an outstanding running back. He has said, he told a TMZ cameraman straight up he won't let Adrian Jr. play the sport. Terry Bradshaw in 2012.
Terry Bradshaw,
one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time.
He's a commenter.
Yeah, he's a commentator right now for I think it's CBS,
Fox, if I recall.
Oh, Fox, that's right. Sorry, Fox Sports. And a good commentator, he's not one who bashes the sport. He's not negative. He's a good ambassador for the sport.
Right, yeah.
And the fact that he told in an interview with Jay Leno in 2012, "If I had a son today," and he goes on to say, "and I would say this to all our audience and our viewers out there. I would say this to all our audience and our viewers out there. I would not let him play football."
Wow.
Not I would be nervous or I would discourage. I would not let him play football. That is something that is really shocking.
There's 3 names. Yeah, you were about to mention one. 3 names that jumped out to me on this list. One is Drew Brees.
Yep, Drew Brees said so.
One of the great quarterbacks, right? The other is a great coach, Mike Ditka.
Yeah.
Wouldn't let his kids play football.
I mean, to think these are people who they aren't bitter towards the sport or NFL. If they had a grudge and they were taking out that grudge, it'd be one thing maybe. Right. But these are people who have had success, are very grateful and gracious about the success they've had. But looking back, they're like, holy cow, I can't. I don't know if I can. Drew Brees, and then there was also Kurt Warner said.
Kurt Warner, yeah.
Yeah, he said that it scares him. And he said, it's different when you put on a parent's hat. And he said, as a parent, I can't avoid the fact that it's a dangerous and violent sport. And Brett Favre, yeah.
Brett freaking Favre.
I mean, talk about someone who has been, again, a great ambassador to the sport.
Arguably one of the best 10 or 15 quarterbacks that's ever played.
Yeah, and beloved. Like, even people who hated the Packers had nothing but love and respect, especially when he retired. And it was like, God, I hated playing you, but that doesn't mean I hate you. Like, they had massive respect for him.
So speaking of Favre, I want to play a clip of him explaining to Christiane Amanpour what his solution for this is. Let me just play it for you real fast.
And so just to point out the graphics, CTE has been found in 99% of deceased NFL players' brains that were donated to scientific research. This is according to the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was identified in 110 out of 111 former NFL players. So I guess now the question to both of you, and let me ask you, Brett, how does one make the game safer? And are the ways that the NFL has responded sufficient?
Well, I think, first of all, how do you make the game safer? You don't play.
So, based on that, I mean, we know that the league hasn't done what they were supposed to, but based on what Favre is saying, he's saying, don't play. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, it's like there are a million different options he could have come up with, whether it's safer like better helmets,
rule changes.
Yeah, rule changes. And if anyone has had the time to, and if there's anyone who has probably put more thought than anyone into this, it's Brett Favre, who's played him for so long, has had injuries, of all the things. And I'm sure listeners have a million ideas that I haven't mentioned, that I didn't bring up, that would make the game safer. Of all the possible ways, the one he said without hesitation was not play the game.
Yeah. And, the thing is that his last play was with the Minnesota Vikings. He finished out his career there, and his last play was a concussion.
Yeah.
He got hit, and the back of his head hit the turf. And in Minnesota, they play inside on AstroTurf, and that's like playing on concrete sometimes.
Right.
And it knocked him out for nearly 20 seconds, and he left the field and never played again. And I know for a fact that Brett Favre is terrified that he has this disease, and he is spreading the word far and wide. But he's not the only one, and it's not just football. So I want to go to break here, and then when we come back, I want to look at other sports that are seeing an increase in chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So, Josh, I think you did more research on this topic than I did. What other sports are we seeing head injuries and CTE in?
Yeah, so there was a pretty thorough study that was done across sports, and the findings and everything were released on a site about complete concussion management, a very medically and research focused site. And in this, it looked at both concussions for gameplay and practice, which I thought was really interesting. And it found for gameplay, we had things like rugby, football, American football, ice hockey definitely made the list there. And coming in, rounding the list at like 5 and 6 were both men's and women's soccer. And it was pretty much, I mean, they were the exact same sports for practice, but American football came in at 3 during practice instead of 2 during gameplay. And women's ice hockey came in at number 2 during practice. Soccer came in at 4 and 5, and ice hockey for men made it on the list during practice too. So it was one of those things where you see, like, yeah, maybe the order might be a little bit shuffled, but this isn't just about like, oh, how people practice versus how they play in the, in game time. It's the sport itself. Like, it is the sport that needs to be addressed, and we've taken a closer look, a harder look. I think the sports need to play a more active role. Like, the NFL, instead of being forced to invest a bit of money into like a new helmet,
right,
they should step up and be like, we are going to lead this. We are just as determined, because if they lose, like if 10%, I think it mentioned in the movie, if 10% of parents told their kids they can't play football, that'd be the end of the NFL.
I do want to kind of talk about how they quantified or aggregated this data for this.
Yeah.
Basically, they ranked it on the number of recorded concussions in gameplay versus, as you said, in practice time. So just so you know, the way they're looking at this, men's rugby, they documented about 3 concussions per 1,000 players. And that ranked the highest for gameplay, whereas men's soccer in this ranked 6th, and they recorded about 1.07 per 1,000. So, you see a difference between them, and just the way the game is played. And then men's football, American football, was ranked 2nd, and that was about 2.5 concussions per 1,000.
Yeah, and I mean, it's I think what's scary about the practice part, especially, you think about the vast majority of places around the country, and think about how much it must cost to have a doctor who knows what they are doing with assessing a concussion and assessing an injury and being able to identify if a player's concussed or not. And how I bet you there are a lot of places that do take it seriously and probably have had coaches go through some training trying to figure out. But that's so different from like a medical expert, like a Dr. Omalu, being able to look at a player, evaluate, and tell without any doubt.
I wonder if you had a doctor on. I mean, because you're right, and I know what you're going at is if you have a underfunded school with a kind of a haphazard football team, they're not going to be able to afford a doctor.
Yeah.
But let's say you have a wealthy school, elementary, in a wealthy part of town, and it does afford a doctor. How long until that doctor starts advising parents not to let their kids play that sport?
Right, and the reason I kind of thought of it is I remember when last season we covered climate change, and we covered like the increased heat and temperatures, and how we covered the 2 different schools where high school players were having heat stroke. One of them, the school had a doctor and had a staff that knew it, could see it, and immediately threw him in the locker room, covered him in ice, stripped him down, and saved his life. And in the other school, they didn't recognize it. They had no idea. It's not like they saw it and they were like, we need to win the game, get out there. Like, no, they do care about the safety of their kids. They just didn't know.
They didn't know the steps to take.
Yeah.
And that boy did not die immediately.
Right.
He was comatose. It took months, but he eventually died.
Yeah, and I mean, to think how, the coaches must have felt too, thinking, you probably go back every day in your head, like, what if I this, what if I that?
Right.
And to think with concussions too, like the NFL, like these teams have brought in some of the best neurosurgeons and doctors to join the team, which is great. I'm glad they did, but it's like, how much are these schools taking? What lengths can they take? I bet you there are coaches who do care, who have taken some training and will really take it seriously. But I mean, compared to someone who can just see that one thing immediately, can tell, like, because maybe they'll tell, like, this is a concussion, but someone can, who's trained can be like, hospital now. You know, that's the difference. And yeah.
I want to talk about one of the sports that is mentioned on the list, but we don't cover enough in national coverage about concussions, and that's hockey. This is from the Associated Press earlier this year. I knew we were going to be talking about this, and I saw this article on Twitter, and I saved it. One of the things it says is that just 2 goaltenders were concussed in the 2016-2017 season, missing a total of 15 games. Over the past 2 seasons, 14 goalies missed a total of 276 games with concussion or head injuries caused by everything from elbows and knees to pucks off their helmets. So it went from 15 games missed between 2 goalies in season 2016, and in the 2018 season, it jumped up to 276 games missed and 14 goalies affected. A monumental 700% jump, between the 2 seasons. So not only is it affecting hockey players, especially in the goalie position, but it's incrementally increasing at an alarming rate.
Right. And I mean, you think of, there's a player named Sidney Crosby who was just, celebrated as like the messiah of hockey in recent years, because hockey, I remember several years back after they had that lockout and they had a full season where nobody played, and then the popularity dwindled quite a bit, and hockey used to be just huge, and then suddenly they were struggling. Right. Sidney Crosby comes along, and he had, in his youth and at college or high school level, he was shattering like Wayne Gretzky's records. Like, he was everything the sport was praying that would come along. Even owners were like, damn it, he's not on our team, but thank God he's here, in the sport. And he's had 4 major concussions, and a lot of people are so worried about him that they are like, experts within the sport itself are saying, like, don't play anymore. Like, we love you. You've brought so much attention. Like, we can't, it is heartbreaking. We can't see you get sidelined for 6 weeks again because, people are laying him out. They see Sidney Crosby. It's like when you see John Elway holding the football, you're going to try a little bit harder to get to him than someone who isn't John Elway or Tom Brady or whoever. Like, you're going to go for him a little harder. And so
I remember a similar player in the early 90s named Eric Lindros.
Yeah.
And he took a heck of a lot of concussions and quit early. His last play, as I recall anyway, he got slammed on the ice, and he was out for a good minute. And a lot of people were upset with him that he didn't produce like, he was guaranteed to, and he was supposed to be this all-star. And they took it as a sign of weakness. But, it's not. It's his brain inside of that skull that's getting racked around. So you can't really blame him or any parent that is saying, I don't want that happening to our kids.
Would you let your son, Barron, play football?
It's a very tough question. It's a very good question. If he wanted to, yes. Would I steer him that way? No, I wouldn't.
All right, John, so I'm taking a look at this article that you actually found and sent over called Falling Football Participation in America, an article by the New York Times. And they took a bunch of data based on football participation and high school football participation by state over the last 10 years.
Right.
So let me ask you a question here. Out of the 50 states, how many of them do you think saw an increase in participation over the last 10 years? How many of them do you think have more high school students participating in football today than there were 10 years ago?
Well, I haven't actually read this article yet, but I would say
half of them?
3.
3 of them.
3 of them.
So I was thinking 25, but you're saying it's like 2.
Yeah, exactly. So we have we actually have Alabama, we have Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. So
those are the 3 that increased?
Those are the 3 that increased. So if you think Pennsylvania and Alabama, they both went up 2%.
That's it. But
and when you think about it, though, like if several hundred or even a few thousand people are playing football in high school, I mean, 2%, that's a pretty big increase. That's, that could be a couple hundred.
Okay.
So, and Massachusetts has seen a 1% increase.
Okay.
Now, let's take a look at a couple other states. So once again, remember we said, like, okay, if there are a couple thousand people playing football, a 2% increase is quite a bit, right?
Sure. So let's look at ones that are big football states then.
So Ohio, I'd say.
Okay, yeah.
Minus 27%.
So participation in all levels of football has dropped by 27%?
27% less participation than there was 10 years ago.
Okay, how about Nebraska?
So Nebraska, a big neighboring state of ours that we know is big football state, minus 24%.
Oh, my goodness.
Minus 24. New York, minus 28. Illinois, minus 22. Wisconsin, minus 16. South Carolina, minus 12. Virginia, minus 18. I mean, these are huge numbers. New Mexico, minus 22. You have Oklahoma, minus 18. Oklahoma, minus 18. Alaska, minus 20. Texas, minus 10%. And think about how many people play football. Like, in Texas, there is only one true religion, and that's high school football.
Yeah,
I mean, there are some places. I read an article not long ago how there are a couple places in Texas where the high school football stadiums that are being built are getting more funding than most college stadiums that have been built, and even some NFL stadiums.
Wow.
Like, there was a high school team that their stadium is getting more funding than the owner of the Chargers requested in San Diego to keep the team in San Diego, and they denied him in San Diego, but this high school team in Texas got. So there, it's huge, and yet the fact that participation is down that much.
So, Josh, we talked a little bit earlier about various sports that are, high-impact sports that are also seeing an increase in injuries. And what the New York Times did is they divided this into like 6 different sports, which include football, hockey, wrestling, lacrosse, soccer, and basketball, and ranked the number of injuries that are common among high school boys playing these sports and where those injuries are located.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me mentioning, John, as like kind of a stats junkie geek here, like the when it says injuries per 10,000 plays, so this is like not injuries based on 10,000 players, but actual plays that were carried out. And this is important for 2 reasons statistically. One, you could easily say that there are physiological differences between, football and hockey or football and soccer play or whatever. And you can, there's a statistical disparity in terms of the number of people who play it. But with this, when you say like per 10,000 competition plays, and that also means like, okay, a football player might be on there for more plays than a hockey player or whatever. So that makes the football player more likely or more susceptible, whatever. So by breaking it up based on the plays, it really levels that playing field in terms of like susceptibility to injury, the types of injuries, and really, once again, just levels that playing field, and gives a much better, a much more accurate representation, eliminating the factors that don't matter, like the physiological difference between, a wrestler and a basketball player.
Yeah, and what they do on this is they give kind of a body outline of a male, and they put a bubble over the area which is affected during the play. Those bubbles include head, shoulder, arm, trunk or abdomen, hand, thigh, knee, lower leg, or ankle injuries. So I'm going to start with probably the least aggressive sport out of these, which is basketball. Basketball had shoulder injuries like 1 out of 10,000 plays. Same with the arm, the trunk or abdomen, about 2 plays. There was an injury. The head was around 7 injuries per 10,000 plays. And the ankle was actually a little more common than the rest of the body, and that was at about 13. Once we move into some of these more high-impact sports, you'll see, as Josh and I go over these, how that kind of intensifies. So I'm going to take soccer, and maybe, Josh, you can do like lacrosse and hockey and football. So for the soccer one, the head injuries were around 11 for 10,000 plays. The shoulder, arm were, again, at 1. The trunk was the same as basketball, 2 injuries per 10,000 plays. The hand was 2, thigh was 5, knee injuries around 5, lower leg 2, and ankle 6.
Yeah, and for lacrosse, we had the same as soccer, about 11 in 10,000 head injuries. But we have 3 shoulder, 1 arm, 2 in the trunk area, 4 for the hand, 3 for the thigh, 8 knee injuries, 1 in lower leg, and 4 for ankle.
A little bit higher than soccer, but mainly about the same. How's hockey look?
Hockey is where suddenly you are approaching triple the head injuries of basketball. So you're coming in at 18. You have, compared to 1 shoulder injury for 10,000 competitive plays, you have 13 shoulder injuries, which those can be extremely expensive surgeries, multiple surgeries, recovering time, like the medical cost and the long-term effects can be huge there. 2 arm injuries compared to the 1 for basketball. And keep in mind also statistically, that's another thing where it's like, 1 versus 2, that's not a huge difference. It's like, no. With basketball, your child has half the chance. The chance of injuring their arm is literally half. It's not just a 1 difference. It is double. It is twice as risky. There's twice as much a chance that they'll have the same injury in hockey.
That's a good point.
So that's why people see like this small numerical difference. It's like, no. This is a 100% difference. And with the trunk, it's the same. With hand, you're looking at a 4 for basketball, 5 for hockey. Thigh, you're looking at 2 versus a 6 for hockey, so that's triple right there. Knee comes in at the same at 3. Lower leg at the same at about 1 there. And an ankle, that's the 1 injury area where basketball does tend to have a higher rate at 13 than hockey at 5.
So how about football? How let's contrast football to basketball. I'm going to read the basketball ones. You tell me what it is on contrast to football. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, so the head injury, if you recall, was 7 head injuries in basketball per 10,000 plays.
And for football, it is nearly 5 times higher at 35. So there's a 5 times greater chance that your child will get a head injury.
So shoulder came in at 1 injury per 10,000 plays.
Let me take a closer look at this. I actually needed my glasses here because, that's 12.
Wow.
12 time compared to 1.
12 shoulder injuries. And then the trunk injuries, injuries to the abdomen came in at 2 on basketball.
Compared to 5 for football.
And then the arm is 1
versus 3
And the hand is 4
versus 11 injuries.
So the thigh, this is interesting, 2 for basketball.
And 7 for football.
The knee injury came in at 3 for basketball.
And for knee injuries in football is 18.
So just real fast, if you add these knee injuries up for all these other sports, they come up just a little bit higher than if you played football.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So 18 versus 3, you're 6 times more likely to get a knee injury playing football.
It's like you're better off putting your kid in like all of these sports, like putting them in hockey and wrestling and lacrosse and soccer and basketball, and they'll be safer than football.
Yeah, exactly. Lower leg, 1 in basketball versus...
And in football, it's a 3.
Yep, and you had stated that ankle injuries in basketball were pretty high at 13.
And that is the highest among the sports, except for football, where it comes in at 19. So, I mean, look at that. I'm just double checking, triple checking here, but it looks like literally every single injury, every single one has a higher rate in football than not just basketball, but
I only found one difference.
Yeah.
If you play football, your injury to your arm is around 3 per 10,000 plays, whereas in wrestling, it's 4.
Oh.
But otherwise, football is far more violent.
Far more violent, and the risk is just way too high. It's not there, I think. And I think it looks like there are a lot of the long-term dip over the last 10 years in participation shows, and the fact that it's continuous. Like Ohio, if you look at it, about 8 years ago, they were at minus 10%, and now they're at minus 27. So 8 years ago at minus 10%, it's not like everyone realized, oh my God, no other sport is fun to play. Let's go back to football.
Right.
They probably found something else, like soccer, like wrestling, like hockey, like whatever. And they were like, oh, okay, well, this is more fun. And guess what? Guess what is the most influential decision maker when it comes to a child playing a sport?
I would think the parents.
Parents or peers?
Peers, yeah.
Yeah. So
I guess that makes sense.
We're growing up in the same neighborhood, and you're my best friend. You go out and you're like, oh my gosh, I just signed up for the lacrosse team or the basketball team. What am I suddenly more likely to sign up for?
Right. Yeah.
Basketball. I want to play with my friends. I don't want to play with some stranger. So all it takes is that one popular kid whose parents and this is where when you mention parents, this is where the parents' influence does, is like a force multiplier, is because especially if you are the parent of an influential popular child, if you're no, you're playing something else, and that kid goes and chooses basketball or tennis or whatever, then countless other students are going to want to play that sport because countless students are going to want to watch that sport, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, that is where it really does become a force multiplier.
So, Josh, this has been, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating conversations we've had. I, again, just enjoy talking to these topics with you, and it's a pleasure as always.
Absolutely. This has been definitely one of the better ones, especially a good medically driven one we've done. And it's interesting to see the trends, and hopefully we will see continued change that will at least either make things safer for the players, or just see fewer of these injuries happening.
Thanks for listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And make sure you check out our website for other episodes, itmightbeinteresting.com. And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. In Super Bowl I, a couple years prior, I saw a documentary where they were joking about how they had to ask people who bought tickets at the end zones to move to the center of the field and
So it looked full.
So it looked full. And this was the Super Bowl, and
Yeah.
now tickets go for like 10 plus grand.